Thank you for joining us today in this interview. It's a pleasure for us to have the opportunity to speak with you here. So, can you tell us briefly what is the idea behind Circulor?
Hello, my name is Doug Johnson Poensgen and I'm co-founder and chief exec of Circulor. So Circulor's business is traceability in supply chains. We help our customers to prove and improve their ESG performance. ESG, of course, is environmental, social and governance. So that can include, for example, demonstrating responsible sourcing of critical raw materials, for example, cobalt used in the lithium-ion battery supply chain, which has concerns around child labour, or other materials, for example, nickel, which have concerns around environmental damage. So we are attributing to the flow of materials specific bits of ESG data, including embedded carbon, in order to digitize the supply chain and support procurement professionals at the downstream brands from using procurement as a tool for driving greater sustainability, for example.
What challenges do your company addresses in terms of raw materials supply chain?
We support customers to demonstrate responsible sourcing, whether that is for raw materials that cause environmental damage or are associated with environmental damage or potentially associated with child or forced labour within the supply chain. And so an example of that might be to trace cobalt from mines all the way into EV batteries, electric vehicle batteries, to demonstrate that none of that cobalt has come from artisanal mine sites where there is a risk of child labour, for example, in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo.
How do you manage to provide the right balance of visibility and control?
When you're looking to manage risk within a supply chain, and of course you're digitizing what's going on within a supply chain, there's a concern around not creating too much transparency, because of course commercial confidentiality plays an important role within these supply chains. There's a difference between traceability, which helps manage risks, for example, of where something has come from, or to help, for example, understand the amount of embedded carbon that is being added by each participant in a supply chain. That is not the same as full transparency, total disclosure of absolutely everything within that supply chain, including, for example, who's buying from whom, in what quantity and at what price. So there's a difference between traceability and transparency.
What is the unique about your approach?
We were the first to be able to demonstrate the ability to track a raw material from mines all the way through the supply chain to end consumption, where those materials change between the source at multiple times on their journey through the supply chain to the point at which they get incorporated within a product. I mentioned cobalt earlier, and I'm going to stick with that just so that I don't use too many analogies. Cobalt is obviously mined as ore. That ore goes into a smelter, then goes into fine refining, it's amalgamated with other materials, and eventually that is used to manufacture the cathode, which is of course alongside the anode the key element of a lithium-ion battery. That material has undergone multiple steps of transformation on its journey, and so you have to be able to connect the input to the output at each one of those industrial processes reliably multiple times through the supply chain in order to be able to demonstrate traceability. Reuters reported that the first example of doing this with a conflict mineral called tantalum in 2018, and we're now working with a whole variety of materials, not just in the battery space, but also with things like the chemical recycling of plastic waste. That at the moment is what makes our approach unique, the ability to track through industrial processes.
And can you tell us what is the role of the different blockchain technologies and how do you integrate them into your business?
Well, our platform is built on Hyperledger Fabric, which of course is an open source blockchain technology layer. But blockchain of itself doesn't solve this problem of improved visibility into a supply chain in order to manage risk. You have to combine it with other technologies. And in our case, that is a combination of IoT, traditional databases where a lot of the business logic is held, blockchain, and also machine learning used, for example, for identifying anomalies in the chain of custody within the supply chain to identify places where audit action should be focused. No digital technology today can completely replace any physical due diligence, for example, that you might do at a mine site or at a participant within the supply chain.
How are the digital technologies transforming the supply chain?
10 years ago, the ability to digitize the supply chain was far more limited than it is today. I mean, we've had EDI systems, for example, we've had procure-to-pay systems for some time, and within the developed world, there is a significant number of track and trace type solutions available for managing logistics. What has not been possible is to digitize the supply chain to tier N, all the way through the supply chain to actually see what is going on within the supply chain. I think over the last 12 months of COVID, we've all come to recognize the relative fragility of our approach to supply chain management and a need to better understand what goes on all the way through the supply chain to the source of critical raw materials. Today, car manufacturers are, for example, suffering from a global shortage of semiconductors. Some car manufacturers have actually had to stop production of some models because of it. And the reason for that is the inability to match demand forecasting with a true understanding of supply chain risk all the way back to the source of raw materials. And I think that's how digital technologies are starting to impact the supply chain. 10 years from now, I suspect, supply chains will be well digitized, and these sorts of tools, such as the ones we produce, will have become relatively ubiquitous.
How do you manage to find good tech professionals, and how do you cope with the shortage of staff within the tech industry?
We're quite lucky because we're a business with a social purpose, in this case to prevent the exploitation of people or planet in the supply chains that we serve. We find it relatively straightforward to recruit good technology talent, partly because we're using a combination of technologies, some more mature than others, but Industry 4.0 technologies clearly do attract people to try and for example become blockchain developers or work in machine learning. But when your business is doing something meaningful, it's much easier to attract talent to come and work for you, because what they will do every day will make a real difference in the world.
Can you tell us what are the key barriers to modernizing the supply chain? How do you build an organization with successful supply chain?
So the key barriers, in my view, to modernizing the supply chain is actually the status quo. We're used to cascading questionnaires through the supply chain, for example, around responsible sourcing or conflict minerals compliance, and just returning paperwork, where the entire supply chain industry is driven by bits of paper and questionnaires and Excel spreadsheets, which is the most predominant technology in supply chain today. And although things like control tower solutions have been around for a while, and a variety of supply chain digitization tools such as ours are now coming to the fore, the status quo, what is done today, is still the primary way of running supply chains. I think overcoming that status quo and having people realize that new technologies will not only help them save money but also materially improve efficiency, as well as manage risks better, will take a little bit of time.
How has the profile of the successful chain professionals changed with the time, and what are the required skills that one successful supply chain professionals must possess?
My view is that the role of procurement is changing. Procurement used to be the function of buying. Increasingly, procurement is now responsible for managing the supply chain, including the potential disruptions and risks within that supply chain, and driving sustainability, particularly of large manufacturing organizations. If you take, for example, an electric vehicle, 70% of the entire carbon footprint of the manufacture of that electric vehicle is from all of the suppliers. How can a car manufacturer achieve net zero if they can't find a way to measure and then manage down that embedded carbon within their supply chain?
How has the COVID-19 affected the supply chain development process?
When the world went into lockdown in March 2020, global carbon emissions fell by about 7%, which is what the Paris Climate Agreement requires every year. And why was that? Well, obviously we all stopped traveling, but obviously we were at home and we were still consuming energy and, you know, ordering things from Amazon, and so global supply chains were still doing everything that they did previously. And what it's done is shone a light on the contribution of the global supply chain across all industries to pollution. And I don't think we would have had that brought into such sharp relief had we not had COVID. And even consumers on the street realized that things like face masks and alcohol gel, relied on all sorts of complex supply chains, and it took a while for them to gear up to meet global demand. So it's thrown the discipline of supply chain management into sharp relief in a way that didn't really exist beforehand.
What will the future supply chain look like?
One word: digitized. I think digitization that has existed between, for example, an OEM and a tier one for some time is going to flow down through the supply chain, so that actually we will collectively have a far clearer idea of what is going on within supply chains, and procurement professionals will have the ability to manage things like the sustainability of their supply chains as part of their organization's own net zero ambitions.
Thank you so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure speaking with you. We hope that we will speak again shortly in terms of your new plans and future collaborations.